we'll go ahead and get started. We have a lot of information that we want to cover in our next 45 minutes with you all. So thank you all for joining us tonight to learn more about sharing your story as part of the application process. We here at our 4 universities are really excited to share about different parts of the application and answer some questions and have a conversation about the application process and how best to share that story, which we think is so important in the application process. My name is Elena Wanzelak. I am a senior assistant director at Washington University in St. Louis, and I'm really excited to be here with you all. And I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves.
Thank you, Elena. My name is Gabriela Flores. I am one of the admissions counselors at the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. I'm excited to be here with you all tonight.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Ford Torney. I am one of the assistant directors of admission at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, and I'm going to toss it off to Will.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Will Cannon at Emory University. I'm a senior assistant dean of admission there. So glad that you're all here, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to share my screen. And so this session, if you don't already know, is part of our NWHE Summer Summit series, which is happening from yesterday, Sunday through Wednesday. This is a series on a range of topics happening at 6 p.m. Eastern each day. And so, of course, this one's on sharing your story in the application. Yesterday, we had our first one to kick off on diversity, equity, and inclusion on campus. And tomorrow's is a student panel with students from each of our schools talking about the student experience. And then we're closing out on Wednesday with a director's panel. So this is one of a series of events that you have joined us for. We encourage you to check out the remaining ones as well. Because these sessions are topical by nature, we will not really be discussing our schools in great detail for these, but rather these will be a deep dive into, in this case, how to share your story in the application. And we're excited to share that with you. To learn more about our schools individually, including on topics like campus life, academic opportunities, admission and financial aid, and other topics, please visit our websites to find more information and events and engagement opportunities which align with those with that information specifically. So for the next 30 to 45 minutes, you will hear from each of us on how you can effectively use the application to tell us what is important to you. And so as you will see, there are many ways through which the application and the application process can relay your story to admission committees reviewing your file. We will start with a brief presentation and then move to a Q&A panel format. We have a number of questions already chosen for this panel, but you are also welcome to submit live questions during the session too through the Q&A. And we will incorporate some of these into the discussion as well. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague Elena from WashU to begin the conversation.
Great, thanks, Will. And I want to start by talking about what is holistic admissions review, which is the way that all of our universities review students' applications and understand your contributions and impact and the way that you're going to create community on our campuses. And what holistic review really is a way for us to factor in both the quantitative pieces of your application, so things like your academic transcript and rigor and courses, as well as standardized testing and things like that, alongside your qualitative pieces. So things outside of the numbers of you, right? We're looking at your letters of recommendation and your personal qualities and your activities and all of these other great pieces of you. Because when we're looking to build communities on our campuses, we know that each student brings with them a very different part of themselves and different things to our college campuses that make them a really exciting place to be for students. And so in order for us to build those communities, we need to get to know you as individuals in this process. And holistic review also allows us to read in context. So not only seeing kind of what you do, but what was available to you and how you've taken advantage of those things in your school, your community, your family. And it's a really well-rounded approach to the application process because we really want to build those well-rounded communities. And I want to highlight a few different things, and then we'll go into more detail about extracurricular activities and essays, because for us, those are really the moments where you can share your story. But in terms of those quantitative pieces, like I mentioned, we are going to consider your academic record. So what courses you've chosen to take, the rigor of those courses, right? If you've been taking honors level coursework or AP or IB, A levels, whatever it may be. as well as standardized testing. And for all of our schools for this upcoming year, we are test optional, which means you have the choice whether or not you want to submit standardized testing. If you don't submit it, that is okay. You're not at a disadvantage at all in our admissions review process. But if you do choose to submit your test scores, know that that's factored into those quantitative pieces. And then the rest that's up here is qualitative, right? So those are those things that give us your personal qualities, your likes, your dislikes, your interests, all of those things that make you a really interesting candidate in our admissions review. So that's letters of recommendation, extracurricular activities, essays, and then interviews or other components, things like the additional videos you may submit for schools or supplemental music or art portfolios or whatever else is included in the application. And again, all of this is really used in a full holistic review process that often seen as counter to a more formulaic. So for us, having a certain GPA or having a certain test score doesn't automatically admit you into university. It's much more complicated and much more complex. And for us, I think it's much more exciting. And before I pass it over to Gabriella to talk a little bit more about activities, I do want to highlight that we know that we've been through a pretty serious global pandemic the last year or so, right? So some of these things may look very different than how they looked 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. And we've been impacted as well, right? We're currently doing this virtually. In a normal year, we might be able to do this in person. As I sit in my apartment, as opposed to being in the office, know that we understand that. And that's part of that context that we get to bring into a review when we start that holistic admissions review. All right, well, that I'll pass it over to Gabriella.
Awesome. Thank you, Elena. So I do want to talk a bit about the role of activities. And so extracurricular activities really can be such a great way to give schools insight into not just who you are as an applicant, but who you are as a person. And so we think of extracurriculars broadly. This is anything you're spending your time doing, whether that's in school or outside of school. So these activities might include any clubs or sports you're engaged in. It might include music or theater. If you had a job or internship opportunity you were able to take advantage of. It can include service work you are doing, whether that is within your school community or within the community in which you live, as well as significant family responsibilities like being a caregiver to a sibling or a grandparent, in addition to all of the responsibilities you have for school. All of these things count and are ways that you are choosing to spend your time or might have to spend your time. And so these are great things to add to that activity list portion of the application. Within that, some things to know is that we do like to see leadership roles. So if you are the president of a club or a captain of a sports team or even a shift manager, listing things like this out for us really helps us to understand how you have been recognized as a leader in your community. And we know that interests vary and that you are unique. And so whatever those activities look like for you, that is what you should include in your application. With that, it's important to know that when you're applying to colleges, we really are not looking for a certain activity list. So you might be somebody who has devoted a lot of time to activities that are very specific to what you think you want to study, while others of you might have multiple interests and you have engaged in a variety of activities to kind of explore those. Both of those are okay. There really is no one way that is better or worse than the other. Really, by allowing us to know what you are engaged in, what activities you are doing, we get a better sense of who you are, what is important to you, what you're passionate about, what motivates you, and how you're taking initiative or making an impact. And this can be really helpful to us because we can then envision how you might continue to explore your passions or interests on our campuses, as well as how you might contribute to our school communities. And so if there really is one last thing that I want to share, because I do want to make sure I leave plenty of time for Ford to talk about essays as well. It is to please remember that when you're applying to colleges, we really are not admitting a transcript or a certain activity list. We really are admitting a whole person, and your activities can be a great doorway into letting us know what it is that you're passionate about, where those interests lie. But I do want to go ahead and pass things over to my colleague Ford Torney at Johns Hopkins so he can talk about essays because those are equally as important as well.
Thanks, Gabriella. And so as, of course, the theme of tonight is really about telling your story. Perhaps one of the more direct ways to do though is through the essays that are part of the application. And generally there are two major types of essays, which I want to break down pretty briefly. One of them is the personal statement. This essay is the one you write basically for all the schools you're applying to. It's the standard essay on the common application or the coalition application. It's not school specific. And then there is also the supplemental essay. These essays are school specific. You're only writing them to one school. So for example, you might write a supplemental essay for Johns Hopkins, and only Johns Hopkins is going to see this. These both allow students to kind of more directly speak with the admissions committee and let them know things that were not seen in other parts of the application. For the personal statement in general, this is supposed to complement but not repeat other parts of the application. For example, if the bulk of your activities list talks about your involvement in a specific club, your essay probably shouldn't repeat all of that information and then add nothing new. However, you can complement or add new context or information about one of your activities, one of your engagements, something that matters to you. The possibilities for that topic are pretty endless, and we encourage students to write about themselves in a way that we have not seen before. The personal statement really does provide a window into who you are and how you're going to contribute to a campus community in a very general sense. But those personal essays are really great to allow us to, again, gain that specific insight into who you are. Supplemental essays, as I just mentioned, are a little bit more specific. They're asking a much more specific prompt or maybe a few prompt options that directly relate to the school that is asking them. In those cases, we really want students to read and understand the prompt fully and answer the question clearly and directly. These prompts are not trick questions. I can pull an example from our own school. We used to ask about collaboration, and some students thought this is a trick question and they should talk about leadership instead. And while we definitely understand students wanted to showcase specific aspects of who they are, those are better suited for things like the personal statement. If a school is asking for a supplemental essay, they're asking for a very specific reason, and when they would like you to answer that as directly as possible. For the supplemental essay, as well as the personal statement, authenticity is really crucial here. We don't want students to try to manufacture what they view as a correct answer or embellish or talk about things that maybe they don't really have an interest in because they think it's going to sound better. Schools want to know who you are as an individual. As Gabriella just said, we're not admitting a transcript, we're admitting a full student. And so while the, of course, academics provide an insight into that, your activities list, your essays and letters of recommendation really give us an insight as to who you are. And so when it comes to the essays, we really want to see that shine through. We want to see who you are in a way that makes sense to you. For all the essays, we really encourage students to write in a way that makes sense for you. You don't have to write in a 5-paragraph format. You are allowed and generally encouraged to use the first person. This is not going to be an essay that you generally write for your high school English courses. This is going to be a little bit more specific, and you're going to be able to, I kind of like toss some of those rules out the window and be a little more informal, be a little more personal, because we do want you to feel like you are speaking to us. As Elena mentioned in the beginning, I just want to highlight this. We recognize that with COVID, there are a lot of contextual pieces that are changing. On the application, on the common application and both the coalition application, there is a section. It's called basically a COVID-19 additional information section. If you have specific context you want to share with us about how COVID-19 impacted you or your family or your academics, you're more than welcome to share that there. We don't want you to feel like you have to take up one of the essays to provide that additional context for us. But you can learn a bit more about those sections on the application portals, but also on all of our websites. We have some information about how to best use that statement. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it back over to Will to help us get ready for some Q&A.
Wonderful. Okay, great. And I see we have a lot of great questions coming in already through the Q&A. Feel free to continue adding questions there. And so we're going to go ahead and get started. We have, four schools, 4 representatives from admission offices here, and we just want to take some time, the next 30 minutes or so, and answer the questions you have and talk about, how the different pieces of an application can come through on our side and maybe offer some insights that'll be helpful for the prospective students out there who may be nearing a point at which you're completing your own applications for various schools, whether they're our schools or somewhere else. We hope that this is going to be useful for you. So we will spend a lot of time talking about pieces of the application, but Elena did a great job of explaining what holistic admission review is, and each of our schools employ holistic admission review processes. So I think it's worth starting out by talking about, how does a holistic admission review allow for sharing your story in various and creative ways, how is the process itself conducive to that in a way that, you know, maybe a more rigid process would not allow for?
I'm happy to jump in first, Will. I think one thing that it does is it allows your individual personality to shine through in the way that you're sharing your story. So we always say to students, you know, if you're a funny person, be funny in your essay. If you're not funny, your essay is not the time to try to be funny, right? Be yourself, be authentic, like Ford was saying. But, you know, I've read activities lists where students in their descriptions of the activity, like, are funny, right? They have a little joke, or the way that they're talking about it is really unique to them. Then I have students that are very, very formal, and they're much more structured, maybe focused student. Their mind is much more organized than somebody else's, and that shines through too. And so I think in those moments of essays and extracurriculars and even letters of recommendation and things like that, your personality is able to come through, which helps us then understand you better as a person, right? Because your personality is not getting A's in your classes. Your personality is all the things outside of that. So that's one way that I think is a really exciting piece of this.
I would add as well that, you know, part of a holistic admission review process is we want to see a lot of different aspects that go, you know, if you've completed an application to a school who employs holistic review, you've seen that there's a lot of pieces that we ask for in the application process, right? And so we're asking for those pieces because each of those pieces, we're trying to glean something about you from each of those, whether that's activities, extracurricular activity, you know, essays or something else. And so part of that is because we value each of those. We think that, you know, all of these pieces in our application process can be a conduit through which you explain something about yourself to us. And so that's why we really want to spend some time talking about that at the beginning, our process, holistic review, because that is a really important part of sharing your story is, you know, how we set up our application and our process. And so I'm glad we were able to spend some time talking about that. But why don't we go ahead and jump to another question? So how do extracurricular activities fit into the narrative of your application? You know, I think that, you know, something like essays, that is a little bit more directly a narrative in many ways, but there are narratives in other parts of the application process too. Gabriella, you talked about activities. Would you mind sharing a little bit about, you know, how do extracurricular activities fit into that narrative, and how might we be able to use that part of the application to glean information about what's important to you and what your passions are?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think, as I mentioned earlier a little bit, extracurriculars really do just give us a bit of a more well-rounded understanding of what makes you you and who you are. Again, they're that doorway that opens up that insight into what you're passionate about, what motivates you, as I said. And so I did see the question somewhere in there. Somebody asked, is it better to be highly specialized? I know, Elena, you mentioned that, or not, kind of on the other side of that. And, you know, the answer is not necessarily. I think, you know, if you are highly focused, like maybe you have participated in several STEM related activities because that's what you're passionate about, that is great. And we want to know that about you. But if you're somebody who is kind of on the opposite end of that, and you have multiple interests, and you want to explore all of those interests, and you have done so through your activities, share that with us. I mean, we have seen students who explored their love for music and art through theater, but they also had activities that helped them explore their interest in maybe studying mechanical engineering. Those things don't necessarily go together, and that's absolutely okay. I think a huge piece of sharing your story with us is letting us know those new pieces about you that we wouldn't know unless you let us know up front. So your extracurriculars can be a great way to kind of give that insight, to let us know your talents, what you value, you're passionate about. And that is really helpful as we're reviewing your application, because it lets us know how you've contributed to your school community and ultimately how you might contribute on our campuses. Because we want students who will contribute, not just academically, be successful academically, but non-academically as well.
And, you know, I would just add too that if there's something that you spend a lot of time on, make sure that we know about that, right? So I think sometimes students think, you know, they sort of try to think ahead as to what we would want to see. If there's something that's a passion of yours and you spend a lot of time on it, but maybe it's not a club at your school and you don't think that yes, we would want to know about that. So feel free to share that with us, because like Gabriella said, that gives us insight into, you know, who you are, what your interests are, how you might contribute on our campuses. And so I think that's worth mentioning too.
Yeah, absolutely. If I could just jump back into, because that reminds me, I didn't mention, in my portion, I guess, of the presentation, if you will, that is very valid too in this time of the pandemic too. There are often times where your activities may have been affected. You might not have been able to partake in that club or the sport or whatever it was. And so we hope that you've been able to redirect your time and sharing those with us, even if it isn't a club or sport, as Will said, or something that may be more typical of what you might put on there. Again, share that with us. Maybe you've redirected your efforts by picking up a new hobby, whatever it might be. There's a lot of bakers out there thanks to the pandemic. Share that with us. We want to know that.
Absolutely. Volunteering, work responsibilities, family responsibilities, all of these things are included in that. So let's go to a question about essays. I mentioned earlier, essays are a very direct way in which applicants can tell their story in the application process. The question is, what advice would you give to enhance the role of a student's essay in the application?
Happy to jump in here. And I've seen quite a bit of questions in the Q&A kind of related to the essays as well. So I'm going to try to combine my answer to cover a few of them. But I think it really kind of goes back to one of the points that we've all made at this point, which is that being authentic is the best thing you can do when it comes to the essays. Don't overthink about using cliches, or if your story is original, or if you're questioning the format or the tone you're using. If you're being authentic in the sense that you're writing in a way that sounds like it's you writing, that you're writing about an experience or a topic that you have a connection to in some capacity, and it is not something that we have already discussed at length in the application, then you're doing the right thing. Don't stress about, did somebody else write about this topic? We collectively have read thousands and thousands of essays. We've read many topics that are all the same. And it's less about, is your topic original? It's more about, is it something that only you could write about? And that's what we really want to see. We want to see your connection. We want to see who you are shining through. And that really elevates essays, because we can very quickly tell if you're being authentic. It's very easy to do so. And when we read that, when we read an authentic essay, that elevates the rest of the application because it fills in those missing pieces. It paints a broader picture of who you are and allows us to visualize you better on our campus community. So at the end of the day, that's our role. Our role is to build a campus community that aligns with each individual institution's kind of core values and mission. And if you can reflect on being who you are in the essay, that is the best thing you can do. And that really helps us in our process, and thus it helps you when we're talking about kind of how to really elevate your own essays.
And Ford, if I can elaborate on something that you were saying about kind of being specific to you, I think just being specific, being focused in your essays, right? I think often it feels like your personal essay needs to be telling the entire story of your life. And in reality, a much better essay topic is one that's very focused, right? A specific time or experience or moment or one thing that you've done, right? One activity, and thinking about that over time. But it doesn't need to be like, I was born on February 25th, 2002, however old the people are these days. And here's everything I've done since then, right? That's going to be way too hard to get in 650 words. And so instead think about, moments or things, experiences that are much smaller. It'll help you kind of focus in your essay and then allow you to have a little bit more fun with it because you're sharing that story with us. You're telling us a specific experience or story, right? It's a narrative. And so the more specific, right, use proper nouns, use things. We'll ride along with you, even if we don't know who that person is. It's much more exciting for us to hear about a specific person or place than to just kind of talk in generalities about things that you do or, kind of big picture stuff. So the more specific you can be, the better in this process.
And I'll just add one thing to support that is because I saw a few questions about it was how long should essays be? Most of these are going to have word limits. We do ask you respect the word limits, but also I use this advice because my English teacher gave it to me in 9th grade and it's carried with my whole life. An essay should be as long as a piece of string, as long as you need to get the job done. If it's going to be under the word limit and you feel like you've written what you need to read, right? Don't feel like you have to write more to fill in the space. As Elena just said, being specific is key. And if that means a shorter essay, then there's nothing wrong with that.
I'll jump in here too on the topic of essays because, think aspects of what Elena and Ford just said, I've observed that as well. there's a tendency, I think, to understandably want to share so much about yourself in your essay in particular, right? In your application. And so what I think ends up happening often is students will try to cram so much into that, 500 words or whatever it is. And what ends up happening in that case, often in my observation, is that it ends up starting to sound a lot like your extracurricular page or your resume, right? Because you're trying to basically end up listing all these things that you're doing because you think that is, the best way to explain who you are and what's important to you. And the reason that I bring this up is because, on the one hand, like Elena was saying, sometimes people try to go really big and include a lot of information in there. But there was something that Ford said earlier, which I've also observed too, which is students kind of repeating themselves in the essay when they've already maybe talked about that, or that's already been sort of brought to our attention somewhere else in the application, right? So, if one thing that you may want to consider is take a look at your application and see what's listed in all of the different aspects of it, right? And then if there's something that's really important to you that you want us to know about that's not listed anywhere else, maybe consider, this is not something like, I'm not telling you that you should write about that thing, but consider it. Consider trying to incorporate, if there's something really important to you that's not coming through anywhere else in the application, maybe consider using the essay to touch on that, because then you're not repeating yourself. We're not reading something that we already saw somewhere else in the application, and you're also using sort of all the pieces to explain as much about you as possible, because it's really hard. I mean, as much as this is, these can be kind of a lot of information. It can take a while to fill out, and we know that. At the same time, it can be really hard to condense your entire life up to this point into one application, right? So just some thoughts on that as well. And I'm glad that you mentioned that, Ford. There are a lot of questions in the chat about the essays, and in terms of how long. The first thing for sure, if there are word limits, pay attention to those. So, okay, so here's another question. What are some common pitfalls you have witnessed in student applications over the years? Are there any things you would advise against in completing an application?
Yeah, I can start us off for this one. There are certainly many different things that we see when we're reviewing applications that we might consider pitfalls, but the one that comes to mind right off the bat right now is probably that habit of maybe procrastinating, especially when it comes to your essays. And so I know that should be an obvious one maybe, but it's worth reminding. Really, we're not sitting there behind the scenes, just so you know, looking at what time you submitted your application. That's not something that we are doing. But oftentimes, if you have rushed your essays, that does become reflected in them. We can often tell that. And so giving yourself time to really take a step back, kind of really reflect on those essays, what they're asking you, what you want to convey to us, what story you want to share with us, and then let yourself kind of get those thoughts out. Go to sleep, come back with a fresh pair of eyes, and then edit it. Also, giving yourself time gives you the freedom to maybe reach out to somebody you trust, a mentor, a teacher, friend, family member. They can kind of review your essays for you. Make sure that you're not making any mistakes like spelling errors or grammar mistakes, of course, but if they know you really well and there's somebody that you trust, they're really going to be able to make sure that your voice is present in the essays as well, which is something I know that everybody on this panel has already touched on. We want to know your true, authentic voice. So that's definitely one that is worth sharing and just reminding people about. I know it seems obvious. Another one is, I know we touched a lot on essay topics. Ford, we talked about that a little bit. Again, we want you to write about what's important to you. But sometimes what can happen is we'll read great stories about maybe a grandparent or their dog, because that's what's important to them. But then by the end of the essay, we might know more about the grandparent or dog and be ready to admit them. And we may not know as much about you. So really take time to figure out what you want to convey to us. If you want to share those stories with us, absolutely do. You definitely can. Those are not bad topics. There really are no bad topics. So all topics can be good topics if done well, all can be bad if done poorly. That's something that we say in our office. So really take the time to figure out what you want to convey, make sure your voice is coming through, because we want to know who you are, just remembering that.
I think to add on something that students are hesitant to do, which I understand, is to be confident and kind of brag about yourself a little bit in this process. I think Gabrielle mentioned it earlier. We only know about things because you share them with us, right? We're not gonna like reach out to you later and have a phone call and say, we didn't see that you did X, Y, or Z, right? That's not how we do this. We take the application that you provided and we learn about you through that. And so be a little bit, don't be so humble about your activities or your accomplishments. I think, especially in kind of describing things, use numbers in if you've like increased club attendance or done a certain number of hours in something or, anything like that. Think about how you can numerically represent kind of impact. And if there's no numerical way, just in your writing, right? How have you made an impact in those areas? And I think often, right, as people, we don't want to brag about ourselves. That seems rude or impolite. And obviously, if you feel like you're towing a line of being too rude, like we don't want that. But in terms of just being your advocate, right, that's a time for you to be your own best advocate. And that's what we get to do then, is say, look at all these great things that this student did at their school or in their home community or in their classes. And that's why they're going to impact our classes. But again, we don't know those things unless you share them. So don't be too humble in this process.
My pieces of advice my usuals have already been taken by Elena and Gabriella, which is fine because when I was applying to college, I also wrote about my grandpa and it was not a good college essay. So guilty of that myself. But a piece of advice that I'll kind of give, which is related to the application because it leads up to it, is by not being involved in something because you think it's not going to be as impressive on an application. You shouldn't be joining clubs because you think it's going to look impressive if you don't actually have an interest in them. And so kind of leading into the application, when you're thinking back about your involvements, this is kind of connected to Elena's advice too, is just be thorough. We would much rather you list too much than leave something out. Even if you think it's not related to your academic interests, we still want to know about it because again, it paints that full picture of who you are. And so leaving stuff out, I think is a pitfall I sadly still see. And we know about it because a counselor or teacher mentions it, but had they not, we never would have known. And so that's my kind of my piece of advice in terms of that pitfall.
So we have a great lists already in well over 100 questions. So thank you for those. And what I'm trying to do is sort of identify questions that will, that are commonly asked here or that will sort of cover a number of questions at once. And so for this next question, to sort of shift in another direction, because we talked a lot about essays and extracurricular activities, what are other parts of the application that can be helpful in sharing your story? And this might be a good place to discuss recommendation letters because that's come up a couple of times.
Yeah, I'm happy to tackle this one first. I think there's letters of recommendation are another great piece of your story. And they're not yourself speaking about you, which is why we focus less about that tonight. But who you choose to write your letters of recommendation really does impact how we learn about you and who you are. Each of our schools have a different number and type of letters of recommendation. So you'll definitely want to look at the different colleges' websites for the colleges that you're applying to understand like how many letters of recommendations are needed and from who and all that sort of stuff. But in general, you want to be thoughtful about people that are going to be able to write about you in a really, I think, positive way, right? I think that's a good thing to start with is if this person can write about you and if they can know you in a little bit of a deeper way than just somebody that may have met you once, right? Sometimes we get a letter and it's like, oh, I met this person once and they're an alum, so they write me a letter. I'm like, do they know you? Are they adding to your story? Or is this somebody that's just going to write about your activities list that you provided them, right? So thinking about teachers or counselors, bosses, coaches, people in your corner that are helping us learn about you from different perspectives that aren't your own, but still do add to that story of you because they're still about you in the end.
Yeah, I agree completely. And just to add on to that, I think oftentimes a question that we get is it beneficial to add or send in extra recommendation letters? And so Elena already touched on all of those main points pretty much. But again, your schools are going to let you know what they require, as she mentioned. But I think it's really important to know that, just like Elena was mentioning, those letters of recommendation give us context as to who you are and who you are in your school community. So as Elena said, if you think an extra person might be able to give brand new context that we aren't seeing from your teacher or counselor, whoever it is that the school requires, then absolutely send that in. But I think it's important to really remember that rule of quality over quantity. I know at Notre Dame, we once had a student submit over 80 letters of recommendation, and they ultimately still were not admitted to the university, unfortunately, not because they sent in that many letters, but because there's really no extra context that those letters gave us. So again, thinking about that quality over quantity piece is really important.
And if I can jump back in to talk about letter recommendation, especially in the context of kind of virtual learning, we keep getting questions in our office, which I'm sure my colleagues have as well, about, maybe you haven't had as close relationships with your junior year teachers or your sophomore year teachers, depending on where you are in your high school journey, as you had anticipated or expected, right? Can you still get a letter from the people? Should you go back to people earlier on? And it truly is up to you. Again, look at what colleges are asking for. Some will say we want it from our junior year teacher or senior year teacher. But in the end, we want to get to know you and as best as we can. And you kind of as a learner and person that's going to join our college campus. That's why often people say we want that junior or senior years, because you as a ninth grader is still you, but it's you a couple of years ago. It's a little bit different, right? Hopefully you've grown or changed or, found new things. And so you can definitely still have people that are virtual, professors or teachers, right? There's letters of recommendation. And if you're somebody that's already thinking about that, right? Find a way to get to know them a little bit better. Find a way to reach out. Maybe they can have a short meeting, or you can have email exchange to help them get to know you a little bit better, that in a way that you anticipated, maybe getting to know them a little bit better in person. But I think often the students are asking that, I'm like, you're asking it at a great time because you still have time, right? To get to know them, to put yourself out there so they can still write a really great letter of recommendation for you.
This might be a good time to bring up a question that we've gotten in various iterations in the Q&A, and has to do, you mentioned virtual learning, and there have been a lot of changes and disruptions over the last year and a half or so. So this question is, can you elaborate on how to discuss COVID-related considerations in the application? So this is, outside of things we've talked about, like activities and essays and even the recommendation letters. It's one of those other parts of the application that was referenced, I think, in the last question. But this is really important because everyone's been touched by this, and we know that you're thinking about it. We're thinking about it. We're living through this just like you are. And so I think we really should spend some time talking about how to discuss COVID-related considerations in the application. I'll open it up, but of course that's going to be, that's going to be specific to every person, right? But let me go ahead and just open that up to open the floor to see any comments on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to elaborate a bit on that because I think I brought up the COVID section when I was talking about my slide. So in general, I think there are two major parts of the application where you can discuss those COVID-related impacts. The most obvious, as I mentioned before, is this optional COVID-19 section. It just provides an empty space, really a free response space for you as a student to discuss any COVID-19 impacts that you wish the committee to know. As Will just said, we understand everybody has been touched by this, and how it has affected everybody is going to be different for every individual person. But that is a great space if you need to provide or feel like you want to provide more context around how it affected you. That can be anything from, I've seen ones where they've talked about, my parents lost their job, so I had to take on additional responsibilities in the house, or unfortunately, people I knew got sick or they passed away, and that affected my engagement. So that might have had a dip in grades. Things like that don't generally have like an obvious place in the application. That section is designed specifically for that. we kind of encourage students to worry less about school changes. Generally, your school profile and your school counselor provide us that information, and we do a bit of homework on our own too. And if we have questions, we can always follow up with your school. We encourage students to use this space to focus a bit more on personal impacts beyond the classroom. Now, if a personal impact affected performance in the classroom, you can obviously use that space. The other section is called additional information. It's exactly what it sounds like. It has a similar goal in mind. If there's context that you missed or you feel is missing in other parts of your application, you can add that there. That can really be anything. Just kind of a quick tangent. I think I saw a few Q&A students asking, well, how can I explain my activities in only 10 slots? If you're running out of space to either describe your engagements or to list them, the additional information is a great section to do that. We do look at that if it's filled out. I also just want to stress that both those sections are optional. You are not required to fill those out. With the COVID-19 one, I know last year we got a ton of questions about how to use this. And a few students would say, like, obviously it affected me, but it didn't really change a whole lot. There weren't a whole lot of major impacts beyond like my school, which I already talked about. Do I need to fill it out? No. If you feel the rest of your application addresses any relevant context around COVID-19, you don't have to fill that out. But if you're not quite sure, when in doubt, fill it out. And if it repeats something, it's not the end of the world because it's not an essay. It's just allowing us to provide more context. But we've generally kind of pointed students in that direction on both the Common and the Coalition applications.
Thank you for that great response, Ford. I think that one of the keys there is that context is always critical, whether that is related to COVID considerations or something else, going on in your life or in your community. Context is always key. And so please use those parts that Ford referenced to make sure that we're aware of anything that you want us to know about, in this case, related to COVID and the impacts of that. So I see we have just a couple of minutes. Our time has gone quickly. And so let me just say again, thank you for just so many questions in the Q&A. We've covered a lot of questions that I think touched on many of the types of questions that were asked, but I think we have time for maybe one more. And so I think it makes sense if we just go around and offer, any final words of wisdom or advice that each of us have on sharing your story in the application. And we'll make this really broad so that you can kind of take it in a couple different directions. If you're inspired by particular questions or types of questions in the chat, or if there's just something that you always like to share in this kind of setting. So any final words of wisdom before we depart on how to share your story in the application process?
Yeah, I can start us off. At the risk of sounding like a broken record, I think all of us have talked about this. I mean, the session is called Sharing Your Story. I think that really is what you should take to heart, though. Really using each parts of the application to share your story with us. Use those extracurriculars to tell us your passions, your interests, your talents, maybe, how you're contributing. Use your essay to share your voice with us and your story, maybe your character, what you value. But doing that and really taking time to carefully and thoughtfully think about what you want to share with us, that really is what is going to make you stand out in our applicant pool. Those often are favorite applications to read because they do stand out. We feel like we really get to know you by the end of it because you've used each piece of the application to kind of help us to get to know you. The only other thing I will say is that to please always remember that your college acceptances do not determine your worth. I know this is an overwhelming process, but you are so much more than your college acceptances. You've got this. So take a few deep breaths and just try to have fun with it.
I always share that advice, Gabrielle, and it's very true. We can all say that. Definitely don't let this define your worth as an individual or as a person, because it's more than just that. My piece of advice when it comes to sharing your story really is don't let your story or your voice be overshadowed by someone else. I think we've already recommended this, when you have somebody proofread your essays, or, just kind of look over your application, make sure there's no glaring issues or typos. If you do this often, it can be easy for people to be like, oh, I would change this to this. I would change this. I would move this there. I would add this. And then suddenly your application sounds nothing like you, because it's 5, 10, 15 other people's voices all overshadowing yours. That's not to say you shouldn't seek out advice or a second set of eyes. We definitely encourage that. But if you're asking for somebody to, proofread your essays, ask them very specifically, can you identify any spelling or grammar or punctuation mistakes? Or if you're asking, does this sound like it's from me? Or is this telling you something you didn't know about me? Do you feel like I'm answering this prompt? Focus on those questions. Don't let them overshadow your voice, because again, as we've said a million times, that's what we want to see in the application.
I'm going to repeat something that Gabriella already said, but start early. Do not procrastinate on this, because it is very, very stressful to the last minute start writing essays, filling out the Common or Coalition application and doing all of that. It takes time. Some of that's just kind of filling in your name, your hometown, your parents' names, whatever it is. Some of it's just kind of basic typing, but it takes time working on your applications. And so give yourself the time to do the applications, as well as continue living your life, right? Senior year, you're also busy with classes and sports and clubs and family responsibilities and everything else that you're involved in. So don't leave last minute. You'll have more fun when you have time to do it, when you don't feel like you've left it at the very last minute. So as somebody that left my college applications at the last minute, don't be a me, right? Be a you, and do better than I did.
We may have lost Elena.
I'll pick it
she's
up
back.
here.
She's back.
Unless Elena's back. Well, so actually the piece of advice that I was going to share as well was to take your time, but I'm still going to have that as my piece of advice, and just state that I think that the fact that 3 of us sort of were thinking that would be an important piece to provide as our final, final thoughts in this presentation should be a signal that, if 3 out of 4 of us on this panel are kind of planning to end with that, then I hope that you take that as that this is really important. That's a strong suggestion coming from us. Don't try to rush it to the end. Give yourself the time. I think that you'll enjoy it more. You'll have more time for reflection and for thought and for looking into the different schools. And so I will still end with that one. With that piece of advice as well. So this concludes the Q&A portion of this, and actually the entire session. I want to recognize that we had so many great questions, and so please recognize that you are welcome to reach out to us, to our schools. We have a lot of different opportunities. I'm going to share my screen now to show a Connect with Us slide where you can see more information about how to connect with us, and turn it over to my colleague Gabrielle to close us out.
Yeah, thanks, Will. So I think I want to start off just by echoing Will's sentiments that on behalf of all of us that have been joining you on this panel this evening from Notre Dame, Washington University, Johns Hopkins, and Emory, we really are so grateful you shared your evening with us tonight, and that hopefully we were able to answer some of your questions and give some helpful information as you might be nearing the college application process. With that being said, I do have just a quick couple of reminders that I want to share with you. As Will mentioned earlier, tonight's session was a part of our special topic series with our NWHE Summer Summit series, and we do have 2 more sessions coming up both tomorrow and on Wednesday. Just as a reminder, the first of those is our student experience panel, where you can hear from students from each of our campuses, and they will be giving some insight into what their college search process was like, maybe how they kind of took on the college application process. That will be at 6 p.m. tomorrow night, same time. And then on Wednesday, we'll be wrapping up the series with a deans and directors panel. So you'll be able to hear from a dean or director from each of our offices. And so we really hope that you join us for those last 2 sessions. And we again are so grateful that you joined us for tonight. Again, if you have any other questions, I know we had gosh, 158 questions in the Q&A down there. We hopefully were able to answer as many of them as we could for you. If not, please feel free to reach out to us, as Will said. You can see our websites here on the screen. Please feel free to go ahead and check out our websites, check out other ways to engage with us, reach out to us with those questions. We would love to connect with you and be a resource to you in any way that we can be. But with that, I think we do all want to return your evening back to you. And again, thank you so much for being here. We hope you have a really great evening. Bye, everyone.